Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. I'm Valerie Sanderson and I'm joined by our political correspondent, Rob Watson. Rob, there's been a huge backlash here in the UK about the police treatment of an 18-year-old called Henry Nowak, who was murdered by a young British Sikh man.
So yes, Valerie, the murder happened on December the 3rd of last year in Southampton, which is in the south of England. Now, the reason why it's become such an explosive issue in the last few days is because it was only on Monday of this week that the court found that Vickrum Digwa, 23 years old, was guilty of murdering Henry Nowak, who was 18, as you mentioned. But what has made this case so sensational is that the family of Henry Nowak agreed to release the footage from the body cameras of the police, and what they showed was quite extraordinary and quite desperate. And if anyone is going to look at it, Valerie, I really strongly suggest they prepare themselves, because essentially the young man is dying of a knife wound. He tells the police that he's been stabbed, that he can't breathe, but they still handcuff him and he dies essentially in their hands. At the same time, the body cam footage shows that the man who actually carried out the murder, Vickrum, he says he's been the victim of a racist attack at the hands of Henry Nowak. Now, that the court case found that was absolute lies and that he was the perpetrator. Now, the reason why it's exploded in this way is partly, of course, just the sheer horror of this video, if you watch it, and millions of people have watched it, Valerie, is this sort of idea that somehow the police essentially were more concerned about being accused of being racist. They were responding to a call that suggested that essentially a white person had perpetrated a racist attack than seeing that someone was dying in their hands. And that is what has made it so explosive.
And Rob, this has become a political lightning rod, hasn't it? Not just at Westminster itself, but also on the streets of Southampton, where Henry Nowak died.
Yes, absolutely. We saw some pretty violent protests in Southampton. A pretty large crowd gathered outside where the police headquarters is in Southampton, and who knows, that there may be other such protests. It was certainly pretty violent and angry stuff. As to the political reaction, I mean, by and large, the mainstream parties, by which I mean the governing Labour Party, the main opposition Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, have said, look, it's really important not to make a bad situation worse, that it's important to try and bring people together. We don't want societal tensions. We don't want division. Although actually all of those parties accept what's, if you like, is for some the central concern here, that perhaps the police have overcompensated after years of being accused of being institutionally racist. Perhaps they're now too worried about, so worried about being called racist that they behave in a way that perhaps most people would find puzzling. But overall, on the right of British politics, by which I mean the sort of populists of Reform and Restore, they're making a different point. They're saying there is quite clearly two-tier policing in Britain, where white people are not treated as well as non-white people. And actually they make a rather broader point that society has gone in such a way, and a wrong way as they would see it, that actually it's not just when it comes to policing, it's in all other areas where white people are treated sometimes not as well as non-white people, as they would see it. The state bends over backwards to make up for past allegations of racism.
Is there a feeling that this is exacerbating racial and cultural tensions that were already existing here in UK society?
Absolutely. And of course, what Reform and Restore, the parties on the right, are saying is this is the fault of mainstream politicians, because they don't recognise how angry white British people are, that they say that they've been made to feel like second-class citizens, and they would make the case, they have in fact been making the case, Valerie, that, look, imagine if the victims had been not white. Imagine or remember how politicians in Britain behaved, including Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, when you had Black Lives Matter, when you saw him taking the knee. But they're not doing that now. That's the sort of argument on the right of British politics. The other parties much more making the case, look, let's not make a bad situation worse, and that parties like Reform and Restore are absolutely doing that, are exploiting tensions, trying to make things worse, when actually the family of the boy who was killed, the man who was killed, Henry Nowak, they've said absolutely that they do not want his death to be a cause for further division.
Is it your sense, Rob, that there's more concern about social cohesion here in the UK perhaps than there's been for a long time?
That is absolutely the case. I was really struck by an opinion poll at the end of last year by a polling company called Ipsos that suggested, I'm just going to glance at the figures here, Val, that 84% of people say that the country feels divided. And I think there's concern about social cohesion absolutely across the political spectrum in this country. And of course, depending on what end of that spectrum you are, you see the problem differently. So, I mean, I guess those on the populist right say that the problem with social cohesion is because immigration has been far too high, because multiculturalism hasn't worked, because there hasn't been enough integration. Where I think other people who think that social cohesion is stretched think that's partly because of populist politicians. Although this incident involves a British citizen, someone who was born here, the perpetrator, yes, it of course is bound to feed into this wider debate about social cohesion. And there is no doubt it is a very big issue here, as is of course immigration, which is closely linked with social cohesion.
And also concern about people's trust in institutions like the police and indeed in politicians and politics.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we often talk about the sort of long-running volatility in Britain, voter volatility, and a sort of general anger that's out there. And there is a public research group called More in Common, which has done some really in-depth research into what is it that's driving this anger amongst the British public. And part of it is economic stagnation, which we've had for a really long period now in Britain, but absolutely part of it is a lack of faith in institutions. That includes politics, parliaments, politicians, but absolutely also things like institutions like the police and the courts. It's really widespread. So, incidents like this, and one keeps coming back to the footage of from the policeman's body camera. It is absolutely the kind of thing that enrages public opinion.
And in the wake of this appalling murder of this teenager, Henry Nowak, what steps is the British government taking in order to try and soothe these racial and cultural tensions?
Well, it's pointing everybody to the idea that there is going to be a very serious review of what on earth went on, that there will be a review of how the police approach race relations and the extent to which they do deal with their past history of racist allegations against them. So it's essentially the government saying, hey, look, we are going to look at this very seriously. There will be lessons learned. If perhaps the police are now overcompensating, if you like, over past allegations of racism, we will accept that and we will deal with that. But I mean, clearly, it's obvious that people are going to need an awful lot of reassurance. And because of that lack of faith that people have in institutions, whether that's politicians or the police, times like this are very precarious, because it's getting more and more difficult to reassure people after decades of losing faith in politics, political institutions and political leaders. So in other words, if you like, we're in a sort of a vicious cycle where the more angry people are with politicians, the more difficult it is for politicians to calm them down again.
Thanks, Rob. That was our political correspondent, Rob Watson. If you want to hear more on this story, just listen to our Global News podcast. Click on the link below. But that's it from this edition of the Global News podcast here on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And bye for now.